PlanetFall, Infinity's End, Book 6, by Eric Warren. Narrated by Larry Gorman. 1. As Caspian stared at the emerald planet in the distance, he realized he was looking through something other than the view screen. He was looking through himself. The smoky image reflected a person he didn't recognize, and someone who would have been foreign to him just a few short seasons ago. His face betrayed none of the discomfort or pain which he'd become accustomed to long ago. Cas had to give himself credit. He'd made big strides. There had been a time when stepping back on a shuttle had seemed like an impossibility. But he'd managed this mission without any trouble, though when 25% of your body wasn't your own, it tended to change one's perspective on things. Cas had always prided himself on his resilience, and this often included his physical characteristics. He'd managed to survive childhood without breaking any bones or needing the removal of errant or malfunctioning organs. He'd had perfect eyesight and straight teeth for as long as he could remember, and he'd never needed any artificial augmentation. So maybe he didn't hit the gym much, but that hardly mattered. The point was, his body had always been reliable. He'd never worried about it shutting down on him. But all that had changed because of Diamant. 4 days ago, he'd woken up in sickbay, having been informed 3 major organs had been regrown, and new skin had been grafted onto dead tissue. Dr. Sachs had done an excellent job. He couldn't see a difference at all. But he could feel the difference. And for the first time in his life, he didn't quite feel like himself. Maybe that was where he found the willpower to continue to go on shuttle missions again and again. Maybe it came from the other him, the new him. Or maybe he no longer had anything to protect. Then again, the fact their ship was only days away from losing all life support might have had something to do with it. "Bring her around for another go?" Box asked from the pilot's seat. Cas shook his head. "We're not getting anything else out of this trip. The atmosphere is too thick. If the captain wants to know what's on the surface, she's going to have to send a team." They'd found this planet 2 days ago, after a harrowing series of events with the Bulak. Their leader, Diamant, had attempted to steal their ship for his own purposes. He had also been the man responsible for all of Cas's injuries, and Cas had almost died trying to stop him. But in Cas's haste to retake the ship, he damaged the USCS Tempest more than she already had been. They couldn't even access the bridge, as it was open to space. The only recourse had been to use this planet as a temporary haven, except they had no idea what was on the surface. 3 survey missions covering different parts had all come up with little to nothing. They could see the surface itself. It was about 60% water and 40% land, with ice caps on the poles and a deep green atmosphere which made everything appear a different shade of olive. Parts of the planet had dense forests and deserts that stretched for kilometers, all tinged a shade of green. But the scanners couldn't read through the atmosphere, and as far as they could see, there didn't seem to be any cities or settlements anywhere on the surface, though the captain insisted the planet had to be inhabited. "Are you sure?" Box asked, his mechanical hands moving over the controls. "We could always penetrate." Cas turned up his nose. "Why do you have to say it like that? Nobody is penetrating anything." The captain was clear. "We stay out of the atmosphere and gather whatever information we can. Nothing else. As much as I know you'd like it." "But the situation seems to require thrusting through the atmosphere in a strong, deliberate movement, like one might see in—" "Stop! Stop it right now. You're not even supposed to be here. Aren't you supposed to be doctoring down in sickbay?" Cas used finger quotes to emphasize his point. "A person can be more than one thing," Box replied. "I can be a doctor and a pilot. And don't forget, it was my piloting skills that saved your ass out in space, and my doctoring skills that did it again in sickbay." Box made a sound like a sigh. "But I guess I shouldn't expect too much from someone who has never been anything more than an engineer." Cas wasn't about to let him win. We both know the only reason we're even here was because you wouldn't stop pestering Evie about your superior piloting skills and how you could come up with more than the other survey teams had. Wasn't that what you said? I never said that. Funny, because whenever you hear something pleasant, you always seem to conveniently have it recorded. But when it's something not to your liking, Captain Diazol could have saved herself a lot of time if she'd assigned me on the first survey mission. I would have informed her without certain actions, we'll never figure out what's down there. He glanced over at the series of rings circling the planet. At least I figured out there are some useful materials in those. None of the other survey teams checked the rings. Cas scoffed. Not that we have time to gather them. We've got maybe another 2 or 3 days before we have to evacuate anyway. That's barely enough time to load all the shuttles, if that's what she decides to do. Box turned to him, his yellow eyes blinking in a pattern Cas recognized as annoyance. He'd been with Box so long he'd learned to read the patterns in his eyes, which, since Box had no other facial features except for a faceplate and a visor covering those eyes, was the only way he could tell what was going on in the mechanical mind of his. I'm sorry. Why are you here again, other than to take up space? Cas laughed and stretched his arms out in front of him. They'd been in the shuttle for a few hours. He was ready to get back to Tempest. I'm here to make sure you don't abscond with the shuttle. Box made a sound like the sharp inhalation of breath, despite not having lungs. Or a mouth, for that matter. I am appalled, shocked and appalled. If anyone should be monitored for stealing shuttles, it is you, my good sir, he replied in one of his annoying accents. He grinned. Box wasn't wrong. There had been a time when he would have taken full advantage of the situation. Him and Box in a shuttle with undercurrent capability, and Tempest out there, unable to move or give chase if they took off somewhere. What's so funny? Box asked in his regular voice. All of this. If we'd been in this position a few seasons ago, I would have told you to fly to the far side of the planet and engage the undercurrent as soon as we were out of scanner range from Tempest. We would have been gone. Ahem. You might have been gone, but I'm quite happy in my position, thank you very much. You would have been flying off by yourself. And since everyone knows you can't fly worth a damn, you would have ended up crash landing on the planet, destined to spend your days on a remote world. And I would have covered all of it up, altered the ship's scanners to make it look like the shuttle disintegrated on re-entry. I would regale them the tale of your tragic yet foolish venture to escape to parts unknown. Simple, really. It bothers me you planned that far ahead. You didn't think I was going to stay with you forever, did you? I always needed a contingency plan, Box replied. One can only fly a ship for so long before they grow restless. He tried to say it with a sinister tone, but it ended up coming out comical. Box had never been sinister in his entire life. Well, it seemed like you were pretty happy watching net dramas all day. You have no clue, boss. I was 3 days from dropping you on the next planet when Captain Diazol showed up. Cas rolled his eyes. Can we head back yet? Or do you want to keep stalling? The planet peeled away from view as Box altered the shuttle's course. Only the rings circling at a 45-degree angle visible through the view screen. Speaking of which, I can't wait for you to tell Evie about our success. It's your fault we didn't make more progress. You didn't let me Don't say it, Cas interjected. If I hear that word one more time, I'm going to reach in there and wipe it from your processor. Box made an errant sound, but Cas paid him no mind. He thought about everything that happened since he'd been that person who Evie had found back on Devil's Gate. It hadn't been that long ago, but now he couldn't even imagine leaving Tempest to her fate. There was too much at stake. Yet despite all their efforts, they were even further from their goal than ever. The Coalition was at least 2 seasons away, and the mysterious threat known only as Andromeda was headed for Earth. After Diamant had told them about their encounter with the powerful and destructive aliens, Cas was more convinced than ever the aliens' only goal, once they reached the inner planets of the Coalition, was to destroy them. And despite the fact the Coalition was thousands of years old, the loss of the inner systems would completely destabilize the region. Cas didn't think they could survive. And while he had no love for the organization that had once exiled him, he couldn't stand by while trillions of innocent lives were at risk. He ran his hands down his face as Tempest came into view, her gray hull standing out against the field of black. Even from this distance, the damage was visible. Whole sections of the ship blown out by either mines from their brief encounter with Andromeda or their attempts to retake the ship from the Bulak. Whatever the reason, Tempest was in dire shape and needed serious help. He only hoped this planet might provide a temporary solution until they could get her up and running again. Cas realized Box said something, but chose to ignore it, instead hoping nothing else would go wrong. If they could just get the ship repaired, that's all it would take. At least that's what he kept telling himself. 2. Captain Evelyn Diazol surveyed the situation in front of her. At their temporary stations, her crew was working their asses off, doing everything to keep her ship in one piece. But they were fighting a losing battle, and everyone knew it. Since the final battle with the Bulak, she'd relocated the senior staff down to engineering, which would serve as the command center for the ship. She would rather have chosen somewhere less busy, but with so many systems offline, engineering made the most sense, as they could route the bridge controls down here. Exhaustion beat at her, and her feet ached. She'd been on them for at least 16 hours already, monitoring the survey missions, putting out fires wherever she could, and trying to keep the crew calm. Most of them were doing a good job, though some weren't taking it so well. Lieutenant Ron, for example, seemed much more on edge than normal, and she'd had to relieve him. His bloodshot eyes and jittery hands screamed impending panic attack, so she decided to nip it in the bud. They didn't need their pilot, as Tempest was essentially stuck in space. Upon entering orbit of this strange planet, the undercurrent system had given out, its patchwork repairs from Sester and Zenfor finally succumbing to reality and cutting them off from all faster-than-light propulsion and any way out of the system. Evie didn't even know why she bothered sending teams to survey the planet. It was clear they'd all be headed there eventually, no matter what. "Incoming message from Rabot," Zoll, her operations officer, said in his characteristically deep voice. "Go ahead," she replied, resting her head against the nearest vertical surface, which just happened to be one of the undercurrent conduits. If she didn't get some food soon, she might pass out. "He reports with emphasis he and Box found no new information during their mission. Should I send them back?" She shook her head. "No. Despite our best efforts, this planet isn't going to give up its secret so easily. Call them back in." She slid her gaze to the side to meet Laura's, standing over at the makeshift tactical station. She gave Evie a supportive smile, which caused Evie to smile back, even though she didn't much feel like it. Laura had been her one constant through all of this, her steady hand. She wasn't sure she'd have made it this far without her. Evie pushed off from the bulkhead and walked over to the far end of engineering, where Commander Sester rested in his cradle, though his long tentacled arms were plugged into multiple systems at once. He was the one keeping everything running. Lieutenant Tyler, his translator, stood off to the side, studying diagrams on some display. Behind him, Zenfor sat in a chair, her long back arched over a terminal as she worked. Not wanting to disturb the council, Evie approached Tyler instead. Tyler was one of the few people on the ship who were receptive to Sester's thoughts. "Any good news?" Tyler took notice of her and pointed to an image on the screen. "Looks like Box found some valuable materials in the planet's rings, Centraxium and Alcurium." "Isn't Alcurium obsolete?" Evie asked. "Maybe for the rest of the Coalition, but we can still use it in emergencies." It won't hold up as long as galvanium or cyclax, but it will do the job. I suggest we put the ship in orbit close to the planet's rings so we can mine the ore without wasting a lot of fuel. Evie nodded. I think we can arrange for that. At least their mission wasn't for nothing. You didn't tell her the bad news, Zenfor said from her station, without turning to face them. Evie's stomach dropped. She wasn't sure how much more bad news she could take. What is it? Vreege's repairs to the life support system were unsuccessful, he replied. Evie pressed 2 fingers to her temple and rubbed. While it wasn't unexpected, she'd held out a small amount of hope Vreege might have been able to do something the rest of them couldn't. His people were brilliant engineers and builders, after all. She glanced back to Tyler, whose mouth shut like he'd just been caught in a lie. Anything else? She asked, louder than necessary to make sure Zenfor heard her. That's all for now, Tyler replied. She stepped away. Taking on Vreege had been a risk, especially after his people had tried to take the ship for themselves. But he'd held his own, and even helped them remove the remaining Bulak, sending them back to the hub where they'd come from. And he'd done it at significant cost to himself. The Bulak were born with a pair of sharp, scissor-like mandibles that could extend from their backs, though Vreege had lost his and replaced them with a mechanical pair. Unfortunately, one had been sheared off in their battle with Diamant, and Zax hadn't quite figured out how to replace it yet. Even with Zenfor's help, the 2 of them marveled at how complex the technology was. But because Vreege had made such a sacrifice for the good of her ship, she couldn't force him to leave once the threat was gone, even though she considered it. He was another drain on their already limited resources, but she wouldn't turn away someone in need. It wasn't the Coalition's way, or at least not the Coalition she thought she knew. Evie retreated from engineering, exiting out the large rolling door into one of the adjacent environmental systems monitoring rooms. She needed a moment to herself. She'd been going full steam for 4 days, and that was after being sliced open and sewed back together like a piece of cloth. She unhooked her family's sword that had been strapped to her back and laid it on the table in front of her, taking the only seat in the small control room. The room was nothing fancy and often went unmanned, except when there was an issue. She chuckled, because there was an issue, and there was no one in here to monitor the situation. You're getting delirious. You need sleep. What she needed was some relief from being in a constant crisis. They'd gone from almost being destroyed by an alien creature to taking heavy damage from invisible mines to suffering constant attacks by the Bulak, wearing them down bit by bit until they could take no more. Since the death of Diamant and sending the Bulak off the ship, there hadn't been any further attacks. So that was something. But they needed time to regroup, and time seemed like the one thing that was always out of reach. Every day, Andromeda drew closer and closer to the Coalition, and with Tempest stuck out here, there was precious little they could do about it. The door slid open to reveal Laura, a small pouch in her hand and a reassuring smile on her lips. Hey. She crouched in front of Evie. Thought you might need this. Ration pack, huh? Evie took the pouch. While not the most appetizing thing, she wasn't about to refuse food. Thanks. How are you holding up? I'm fine. What's the tactical situation? Laura gave her a look. I didn't come in here to talk about the tactical situation. Evie ripped open the pouch and took a bite of the bar inside. It was slightly grainy and chewy, but had a good flavor. I know, she said with a full mouth. I don't mean to be so clinical sometimes. She swallowed. It's my default when I don't know what else to do or say. Laura took her free hand. You don't have to say anything. I know you're exhausted. Anyone in your position would be. Evie glanced at her sword, her grandmother's sword. Ever since they'd been boarded, she'd taken to carrying it around with her, despite it being against regulations. She didn't keep it with her to feel safe. Instead, it gave her a sense of always being prepared. as if no matter what happened, she could take it on as long as she had that sword. It was a part of her she'd never let go.
"Is there anything I can do for you?"
Laura asked, bringing Evie's attention back. She shook her head.
"This is plenty, thank you. I'm afraid we're running out of time. It won't be long before the ship becomes uninhabitable for most of the crew." "So what are you going to do?"
Laura asked softly.
"Whatever I have to do,"
she said with a confidence she didn't feel in her heart. She didn't want Laura worrying about her resolve or her mental state. Although the planet down there, looking exactly like the same one she'd seen in her visions, wasn't making her feel much better. It was like they'd been led here for some purpose she couldn't see, and she didn't like the idea of someone out there pulling at her strings, causing her to act and react without reason. And she knew what they'd find as soon as they landed on the surface. What remained of those gray-faced bastards who were on their way to the Coalition right now to annihilate it. And while part of her wanted to go down there and interrogate them, find out why they were doing this, another part of her wanted to turn the ship around and leave this place forever. Something about it felt very wrong.
"Hey,"
Laura stroked Evie's cheek. She hadn't realized she'd started crying.
"I'm sorry."
Evie wiped her eyes.
"I'm tired. I should have said it from the beginning. I'm just tired. Sweetie, you're exhausted. Why don't you take a few hours? I'll come and get you if something happens."
Evie drew a deep breath and exhaled through her nose, trying to calm herself. Everything was going to be okay. If she kept her head, everything would be fine.
"Thanks. I think I'll do that."
She took her sword and strapped it back on for the short trip up to her quarters on level 7. She took the rest of the ration pouch with her. She'd feel a lot better after a few hours of sleep. She turned back to Laura as she reached the door. The thought had been plaguing her for days, having finally reached her lips.
"Do you think I can get us out of this?"
Laura smiled.
"I know you can."
3. 10 minutes after Box landed in Bay 1, Cas was back in engineering, going over the most recent reports from Sester and the others.
"Seems inevitable, doesn't it?" he asked.
"And sooner than we thought," Zenfor replied.
"The system is crumbling under its own weight. Life support will be offline in 6 days."
6 days? Cas found it hard to believe. That wasn't even enough time to load up all the supplies they would need. And that was if going to the surface was a viable option. Evie had shared her concerns with him about what she thought was on the surface. Maybe she had seen this planet in her visions with Sester, but that didn't mean the visions were premonitions. And if the aliens were on the surface, wouldn't they have seen some evidence from orbit? Some power sources, light, cities? Some scarring on the surface from development or infrastructure? But there had been nothing. It was as if the planet was untouched by any kind of intelligence. Evie stormed back into engineering, holding up the same report Cas held in his own hands.
"Is this accurate?"
she yelled. Tyler glanced up. "Yes, ma'am."
"Why didn't you tell me this before?"
Her voice was sharp, accusatory. Cas didn't often hear her like that. "Ma'am, I did. I told you Vreej
hadn't been able to get the life support fixed. Yes, I heard that part. But 6 days?
I told you that as well." Tyler's face turned red. Evie looked confused and returned her attention to the display on her personal device.
"No matter," she said. "Senior staff meeting right now, weapons room."
She turned and left before the massive door had a chance to roll back into place. "What was that about?" Cas asked Zenfor.
She remained hunched over her workstation. "The captain is overworked and exhausted, and she has been pushed to her limit."
Cas should have been more aware of his captain's state of mind. He was the first officer, regardless if it was in title only. It was his job to notice and address these things before they became problematic. But he'd been so focused on keeping the ship together and dealing with his strangeness of self, he now felt he'd ignored one of his primary duties. He jogged after Evie, then turned off the report on his own personal device. When he reached her, she was already in the weapons room, standing at the head of the display table inside.
This will have to be our conference room, until we can access the bridge again.
The weapons room wasn't large. It had been where Cas and Zenfor had worked when she'd first come on board, back when Cas had inserted himself back into the Coalition by force. That hadn't worked, and now he was back in it anyway, at least unofficially. It wasn't as if he had a rank on his jacket, but the title still applied.
"Are you okay?"
he asked. Evie huffed.
"I wish people would stop asking that."
"Let me do this. You can—"
"If one more person tells me to go lie down, I'm going to start shoving people out of airlocks," Evie replied. "I'm fine. Being tired is part of the job. I don't want to hear another word about it."
Cas nodded, taking a spot to the left of her around the table as the rest of the senior staff filtered in. Cas caught Raffinkel's eye as she trudged through the doors, taking a spot furthest away from him around the table. Wolf, Zax, Zoll, Uma, and Tyler filtered in behind her. They all looked exhausted, and Cas couldn't blame them. Everyone was running on fumes. Before everyone had even taken their spots, Evie began.
"The most recent reports from engineering show life support for the entire ship will fail in 6 days if we don't do something drastic."
There was a rumble from Zax and Wolf, but Cas caught no look of surprise from anyone else.
"Despite gaining little information from the survey missions, we have no choice but to head down to the planet."
"What good will that do?" Raffinkel asked, her short blonde hair partially obscuring her eyes.
"If the ship becomes uninhabitable anyway, we're just going to be stranded down there?" "No. I want to leave a skeleton crew aboard. I've been assured if we can shut 90% of the ship down and focus on repairing one system at a time, eventually we'll be back up to speed."
"How long will that take?" Lieutenant Uma asked. 3 to 4 weeks at best," Tyler replied. Despite his young age, lines had crept onto his face that hadn't been there when they'd begun this mission. "Assuming we can rotate out the maintenance crews."
3 to 4 weeks?
Raffinkel asked, incredulous. Cas hated to admit it, but he agreed with her. That was 3 to 4 weeks where Andromeda was that much closer to the Coalition. 3 to 4 weeks further behind. It didn't sit well with him.
"We don't have much choice," Evie said. "It's either use the planet as a lifeboat and repair the ship one system at a time, or we stay aboard and wait for the air to run out. Which one would you prefer?"
Raffinkel looked taken aback from Evie's words.
"How skeleton is skeleton?" Commander Wolf asked.
She was the bridge engineer who liaised with Tyler and Sester to keep the ship running, but ever since the bridge was offline, she'd been relegated to a side station in engineering, and hadn't been shy about letting people know her displeasure with it. Cas had noted she no longer called Evie out, as she did right after the incident at Omicron Terminus.
"As few personnel as possible, with 2 exceptions. Sester and Zenfor will be staying aboard permanently," Evie said.
Voices erupted, and everyone spoke at once. "That's enough!" Cas yelled over the din. Raffinkel shot him a nasty look, and everyone else quieted down.
"The fact is, Sester is too large to transport in our shuttles, so it makes sense he stays aboard. Zenfor has additional protections to low-oxygen environments if she needs them. With everyone else gone from the ship, they should have enough life support to last until they repair the system. They can also coordinate while maintenance teams are switching back and forth from the planet." "Captain, you can't seriously think about leaving a Coalition ship in the hands of a Sill," Uma said. "I don't have anything against the Council, but that is off regulation." "Karen, we're off regulation, in case you hadn't noticed. Sester can't do it alone, and Zenfor has the skills to make it work. The other option is leaving Cas up here." She turned to him. "No offense, but I believe the Council can get the job done quicker."
"You'll get no argument from me," Cas said. Given the choice, he'd rather be down exploring the planet than be stuck on the ship alone with Sester. Zenfor was the right choice for the job. She understood Sester without a translator, and she had the knowledge. Plus, Cas already knew she was more than happy with the arrangement. Evie had brought this possibility to her before they'd even reached the planet, in the case of an emergency. "Do we just stay on the planet then, waiting until the ship is repaired?" Saul asked.
"That's the plan," Evie replied. "We'll coordinate with Tempest from a camp we established on the surface. All the species on the ship should be fine in an environment down there. It has plenty of oxygen, water, and heat. If we can get through whatever is blocking us in the atmosphere, we can set up energy collectors to take care of our energy needs. They're smaller versions of the one Tempest is currently using."
Cas thought he caught something strange in Zal's voice. Despite the fact it came through an artificial processor and was one of the most terrifying and cringe-inducing voices he'd ever heard, he caught something that he'd never heard before: apprehension. He wasn't sure if Zal was just nervous about heading down to a planet, or if he was afraid because the apparatus that generated his appearance still hadn't been repaired yet. He wasn't sure why being on the planet would be a problem. But then again, he didn't understand a lot about the Untubru as a culture. He made a mental note of it, and filed it away to address later.
"Are there any other objections?" Evie asked. "Not that they're going to matter, because we're out of options."
No one said anything else, though gazes flitted back and forth all over the room.
"Good. Then here's the plan. We'll split the crew into 3 waves. The first wave will be our security." She turned to Uma. "I'll leave you to work out the details. They'll need to be armed well and have enough supplies to set up a perimeter. If there is something living down there, I don't want it coming for us in the night. Wave 2 will follow with most of the primary crew, including myself. Wave 3 will be the first maintenance crews, who can stay on the ship an extra few days and get repairs moving. Wolf and Tyler, you two will coordinate. Then they'll join us on the surface, where we will send up the next crew to meet with Sester and Zenfor."
Wolf grumbled something, but Cas didn't hear it.
"What was that, Commander? I didn't hear you,"
Evie said, sarcasm dripping from her voice.
"Nothing, Captain,"
Wolf replied, though Raffinkel shot her a knowing look. Evie tapped a button on the table, bringing up a holographic image of the planet in front of them.
"I've identified the optimal landing zone will be here," she said,
pointing to a lush jungle area near the planet's equator.
"It has an optimal temperature, and if it's anything like the rest of the planets in the galaxy, should have abundant access to water and food."
Cas thought he saw Zal bristle, but it had to have been his imagination. Untuburu didn't show their emotions, not in his experience anyway.
"Any questions?"
Evie asked. No one else moved.
"That's it then. Department heads, notify your station managers. Make sure the entire crew is ready to leave by tomorrow. Cas, I want you to coordinate loading all our supplies on the shuttles. We'll be using every last one of them, as well as the space wings."
Cas nodded. He saw something, but didn't want to bring it up in front of the rest of the crew.
"Dismissed," Evie said,
and everyone filed out. Once they were all gone, she took a breath, then slid her eyes to the side to watch Cas.
"What did I miss?"
Cas hesitated, but decided it was better to point it out than not. "Why are we landing in the middle of a dense jungle when the southern continent has grassy plains?" he asked, pointing at the image still hovering in front of them.
"How crazy would I sound if I said it feels right?"
"Only somewhat crazy. Does it have anything to do with your vision?" Evie sighed.
"In the vision, I saw myself standing on a large hill with all those things below me. It could have been a mountain, I'm not sure. But I don't want to be anywhere near a place that looks like that. The jungle seemed like the better option. No hills, no chance of any prophecies coming true."
Cas considered it. "If you say so. I just hope this is the right move. It seems like no matter what we do, we only fall further behind."
"I know. And I won't pretend these past few weeks haven't been extra rough. But we'll get through it. As soon as we get the ship repaired, we'll be on our way back."
Not that it would do them any good. Andromeda would be half a season ahead of them by then, unless Zenfor found some way to fix her drive engines. But Cas didn't express these thoughts. Evie knew as well as he did. He didn't need to drive the point into the ground. He only nodded and turned to leave. As he reached the door, he turned back to her. "I know you don't want to hear it, but I'm duty-bound to inform my captain she is exhausted. She needs to get some rest before we go down. And if she doesn't, I'll be forced to file an official report on the matter." A grin played at her lips.
"Traitor?"
Cas left her in there alone. All he could do was hope she took his advice. 4. Cas made his way down the corridor toward the closest hypervator. When he turned the corner, he was dismayed to see Raffinkel standing outside the doors, waiting as well. He winced and almost turned around, but he knew she'd already seen him, and he didn't want her to think she'd gotten the best of him. He couldn't think of a worse person to have to ride the hypervator with.
"Commander,"
she said as he stood beside her, waiting. He cringed. Technically, he had no rank, and it always irked him when someone used what would be a standard rank for a first officer with him. But while most people did it out of habit, he could tell Raffinkel knew it got under his skin. "Chief," he replied, trying not to engage.
"Pretty bold plan from our captain,"
she said, keeping her eyes forward. "We do what we have to," he replied. Why was this hypervator taking so long?
"I noticed you didn't voice any objections."
He wasn't going to do it. He wasn't going to get into a debate with her about Evie's decision. She was the captain. She made the call, and he'd agreed with it, despite the fact he felt like they were doing nothing but backtracking. All their work had been for little reward, and a lot of it felt pointless. But if he voiced those concerns to Raffinkel, she'd probably use them as the basis for an argument to stay on the ship, or usurp Evie's authority. It wasn't as if they could make a complaint to Coalition Central out here if a coup did happen. "Do you have a launch plan in mind for the Space Wings?" Cas asked. Where was the hypervator? He hadn't used one in a few days, and now he knew why. So many of them were down or damaged. This was taking forever.
4 with each group of shuttles, she replied, which includes me. I could have stayed to coordinate, but we're 1 pilot short.
Cas held his tongue. She was talking about Gripen, the pilot who had died on Cas's mission back in Coalition space when they'd encountered that space creature. And even though Licia had volunteered for the mission, Raffinkel still blamed Cas for her death, and she probably always would. "That should be fine," he replied, trying to keep his voice even. "I don't know what we'll find down there, but without any structures, I don't think we'll need more than 4 space wings to a group. And if you happen to find something, you should be able to clear it easy."
"Look,"
Raffinkel said, turning to him and poking a finger in his chest. Cas noticed it was right where the blast from Diamant had hit him. Underneath that finger sat skin and organs that weren't his. They were new. "The Space Corps didn't assign me and my team to this ship to be captained by a wet-behind-the-ears officer who has no clue what she's doing. Not to mention a former criminal first officer. You can bet if this was the Coalition, I would have already filed a formal complaint and had both of you removed from service." "That is your right. But while we're out here, I expect you to follow your orders, whether they come from the captain or myself. Anything else I'll treat as insubordination," he said. "Is that clear?" Her mouth turned into an ugly grin. "Do you think you have authority here? That you're anything more than a token officer filling a space that needs to be filled for convenience, if nothing else? You are a criminal who has been kicked out of the Coalition more than once. Don't think I don't know about your hearing. I have friends all over the Coalition." Cas was taken aback, but he tried not to let it show on his face. His trial before the Coalition Committee was supposed to be sealed and secret. They had even deleted the full transcript of the event. How had Raffinkel heard about it? Had she known someone on the board that had interviewed him? And if so, which one of them had leaked the information?
"That's right," she said. "I know you're this close to being thrown back into a cell for the rest of your life. So don't pretend any of this," she gestured to the ship, "is anything more than a fantasy. When we get back, it's all over for you, especially after they learn about how you invited a hostile force aboard who tried to take over the ship."
"That wasn't intentional," he snapped.
"Whatever you say. I'm sure they'll believe that from someone who used to work for the Sargan Commonwealth."
The hypervator doors finally opened, and Raffinkel stepped inside.
"Going down?"
she asked, her voice sickeningly sweet. "I'll take the next one," Cas said through clenched teeth. She shrugged, and the doors closed, leaving him alone to the corridor. Should he inform Evie? Or would that only lead to further stress on her part? He couldn't believe it. Raffinkel knew someone on his review board, and she knew they'd given him a stay of execution because of Zenfor. What would happen when they returned? Even if they were dealing with the Andromeda crisis, would they take the time to remove Cas from the ship now that Zenfor no longer needed him? And what about Evie? If Cas allowed Raffinkel to openly challenge her authority, it could lead to chaos. He'd have to find a way to keep her from doing anything drastic, which was easier said than done. Rather than wait for another hypervator, Cas headed for the access corridors. He'd get down there the hard way. Cas emerged in Bay 1, scanning the area for Raffinkel. She'd been on her way down here as well to start coordinating the assignments with the other Space Wing pilots. Fortunately, she wasn't around. She was probably over in Bay 2, either complaining about the futility of their mission or sulking in her office near the back. Either way, he needed to get to work. They had to transport 119 personnel down to the surface, along with supplies and food for 3 to 4 weeks. Normally, he would have coordinated with the maintenance chief for Bay 1, Abernathy, but Cas avoided the spot on the ground where he'd seen Abernathy's head roll off, after it had been unceremoniously removed from his body by the Bulak, and instead turned his attention to the flight controllers in the giant windows overlooking the bay. Once he caught their attention, he waved one of them down. "So we're headed down to the surface after all, huh?" Cas turned to see Captains Ryant and Yan making their way over to him from Bay 2, Ryant's voice echoing off the walls. As always, his trademark goggles were perched on top of his head. Cas didn't think he ever took them off. And while he had an iron jaw and was a good half-meter taller than Saturina Yan, she always seemed like the more imposing of the two. Maybe it was because she only spoke when it was necessary. Ever since he'd met her, Yan had been quiet, reserved, but deadly when necessary. They were the only 2 Space Wing pilots Cas had gotten to know. He assumed the rest probably wanted nothing to do with him after what happened to Griffin. Ryant and Yan weren't like that. "Those are the captain's orders," Cas replied. "Can't believe it, man," Dorsey Ryant said. "Abandoning ship. It's a ballsy move." "Is that what Raffinkel told you?" Cas said, heat rising in his cheeks. Ryant shrugged. "Is that not what's happening?" "No," Cas emphasized. "Sester and Zenfor are staying on the ship. We're going to have maintenance crews going back and forth all the time. We're not abandoning anything." "Man, what is that woman's problem?" "You'll have to cut her some slack," Yan said. "Today is the anniversary of when Griffin joined the team. She's extra sensitive today." Cas cursed under his breath. While he could understand anniversaries could be painful for people, Raffinkel had outright threatened him. Could it be anything else? Jan's mouth turned into a frown. "I don't think so. Why?" Cas hesitated. While he trusted these two, discussing their commanding officer behind her back could lead to even more cards stacked against him. but only if they let it slip, which he didn't think they would. Both Dorsey and Jan had risked their lives for him, and vice versa. He could trust them. It's just... She threatened to pull your squad from Tempest when we got back. It seems she's not happy with the new chain of command. Jan arched an eyebrow.
You or the captain?
Both. I can't say I'm surprised, Ryan said. She's always been a stickler for the chain of command. And ever since the death of Captain Green, she's been more on edge than usual. I didn't pick up on it until you said something, but it makes sense now. She was a big admirer of his. I think his death might have hit her harder than we realized. He turned to Jan for confirmation.
His death hit all of us hard, Cas replied.
And it doesn't help we haven't had the chance to even have a proper funeral. An idea sparked in him. They still had the captain's body in stasis in the morgue. He wondered if Evie would be open to holding a ceremony down at the surface. It might be a good chance for the crew to reflect and pay tribute to their captain and to all their fallen comrades. It might be perfect timing. You don't have to worry about us, Ryan added. The Annihilator here and I will stay aboard, even if she tries to pull our squad. We've got your back. Jan looked up at him.
The Annihilator?
Yeah, I thought you needed a new nickname. And since your ship has more guns than all the others, plus you did blow a few holes in the ship, so...
Then what are we going to call you? The Fumbler?
Hey, that was one time, Ryan protested, and I was half drunk. Do you know how hard it is to hit something dead center when your vision gets blurry?
Not for all of us.
Plus, I thought that's what those were for, she replied, tapping the goggles on the top of his head. Jan turned back to Cas.
Don't worry about Raffi. She's not going to do anything. Especially because the Coalition is going to be dealing with much bigger things by the time we get back.
Yeah, Cas replied. I hope you're right. The man who'd been up in the flight control room came jogging into the bay through the main entrance. You wanted to see me, sir? I hope you had a big breakfast, because we have a lot of preparation to do. 5. This is racism, pure and simple, Box yelled as he strode across the landing area in the bay. Just wait until the Judge Advocate General hears about this. You don't yet know the meaning of a lawsuit. I will own this ship by the time this is over. Would you shut up and get on the damn shuttle already? Cas yelled back. Evie watched this exchange from across the bay, doing her best not to let her annoyance show. Box had been complaining about being on the first wave headed down to the planet ever since Cas had informed him. The fact his body was more resilient than most organics, and he didn't need to breathe, didn't make a difference. He was still upset about being cannon fodder, as he put it. Evie thought it was nothing but bluster. But wasn't she using him as part of their initial wave because he was a robot?
Box, wait up.
Evie trotted over to the two of them, arguing at the foot of the shuttle's ramp. Captain, my individual rights as a person are being violated by this man. Box pointed at Cas. Would you stop complaining for once in your life and do your job? Cas grumbled. Evie put on a sweet smile.
Box, I want you to know I'll be recommending you for a special commendation once we get back home. I think it will go a long way to helping Coalition Central make a decision on your personhood status. His yellow eyes blinked once. She thought that might mean he was skeptical. You're just saying that to get me on the ship. No, it's long overdue. You've been a tremendous help to this crew. In fact, you are one of its most valuable members. We wouldn't be where we are today without your help. You've been essential.
Something clicked in the back of Box's head.
You've been essential,
Evie's voice said again, distorted from the recording. Hear that? He turned to Cas. Evie crossed her arms. Did you have to do that? Being the most important member of the crew, I didn't need to hear it, Box replied. But it helps for everyone else to know how things stack up. Evie sputtered.
Wait, I only said
I would like my special commendation to come with a full Navy ceremony as required by coalition law, Box interrupted, puffing out his metal chest. And I want my medal to be magnetic, so I can display it right here. He tapped his sternum.
See what you've done? Cas whispered.
Excuse me, peasant. Box pushed past Cas. Hero coming through. I have to lead this motley crew to victory on the planet's surface. You know, to make sure it's safe for the weaklings like yourself. Thanks, Cas said.
We'll have your ceremony when the ship is repaired, Evie called after him.
He flitted his fingers like it no longer concerned him, his head raised high as he disappeared into the ship. I am really thankful I'm not going down with the first wave, Cas said. She shrugged.
He deserves it. He's gone far beyond the capabilities of any autonomous robot I've ever seen.
Yeah, 'cause he's insane. She surveyed the scene. 14 shuttles, all full of crew and supplies for the first run. Most of their security forces were on those shuttles, prepared to secure the landing site Evie had picked out. Though she'd left a few behind for the other waves, just in case.
Is that everyone?
Almost. Cas looked over her shoulder. Laura stood a few meters away, a pulse rifle slung over her shoulder in the same manner Evie wore her sword. She didn't see Cas leave, but he must have, because it was just the two of them now.
Ready to go?
Evie asked. Laura nodded.
Ready. We'll be waiting for you down there. Got all your equipment?
Again she nodded, but didn't move from where she stood. When Uma had given Evie her outline of who would be going down and when, she'd been surprised to see Laura's name at the top of the list for Wave 1. She'd tried not to be too conspicuous about it, but Uma had explained she was one of the more skilled tactical officers, and Uma had chosen her to lead the Wave 1 team. In that moment, Evie cursed Laura for putting in so much practice on the simulators. But there was little she could do about it. Pulling Laura off the rotation would look like favoritism, because that's exactly what it would be. So she'd approved the assignments. The only problem was she had a bad feeling about what was on that planet, and she didn't like the idea of Laura going down there without her. She couldn't put her finger on it, but it felt as real as anything else she knew. Now, with Laura standing here in front of her, she was afraid it might be the last time she'd ever see her. They'd already said goodbye once in her quarters a few hours ago, but still, it was nothing like seeing the person you loved for the last time. Evie was greedy, and she knew it. She should have stayed in engineering, but she couldn't help wanting to see them off, to see her off.
Anything else, Captain?
Laura asked, and Evie noticed a brief shimmer in her eyes before she blinked it away.
Good luck down there. We'll be behind you in a few hours, Evie replied.
Laura hesitated, then took a deep breath and stepped onto the shuttle. She disappeared into the body as the ramp retracted and the door closed the shuttle off. Evie made a twirling motion with her hand to the flight controllers and left the bay, with Cas reappearing from wherever he'd gone to give them a last moment of privacy. You okay?
Fine.
Box won't let anything happen to her, he said, and we'll be down there before you know it.
I know,
she replied absently. She wasn't looking to be placated. They took the short ride on a hypervator back up to engineering, as the flight controllers kept her apprised of which shuttles were launching. Once they were back in engineering, Tyler already had a visual pulled up of the bays on the outside of the ship. The last of the shuttles are launching now, he reported as they entered. Space Wings 1 through 4 are on standby and waiting in formation.
Raffenkel took the lead?
She'd gotten the impression from the chief she hadn't liked Evie's idea. It was surprising to learn she was going down with the first wave. Yes, ma'am.
Course is plotted and laid in,
Ensign Rivers said from one of the adjacent stations. She'd been responsible for creating the landing plan for all the shuttles in their designated location. But the real test would be once the ships were through whatever was blocking their scanners. Once they could get a good read on what was down there, they'd have a much greater chance of success.
Here we go,
Evie said under her breath.
Tell them they are clear to proceed when ready.
Evie watched all 18 of the ships line up in a standard entry pattern. She turned to Uma, who manned the tactical station adjacent to Engine River.
Anything out of the ordinary? Nothing yet, ma'am. Let's hope it stays that way.
They're approaching the atmosphere, Cas said, his eyes on his own monitor. All the power levels look good. Evie took a breath. She had to remember to breathe. She hated not being fully prepared in any situation, but this one felt like it was so much worse. They couldn't afford to have any mistakes, not with the entire ship and her crew on the line. Entering the upper thermosphere, Cas said.
How far down did our scanners penetrate?
She thought she saw her first officer shudder, but it could have been her imagination. Top levels of the stratosphere, Zal replied. Everything below that was a blank. This is Fleet Commander Box reporting in. Evie caught Cas curse under his breath. Maybe the accommodation hadn't been the best idea after all. By the time they got down there, he'd have started a coup against them.
Go ahead,
Evie said into the comm. We're skimming the upper layers of the stratosphere, Captain. My superior optics can report the landing zone is in sight and looks to be clear of any hostiles. I'm not picking up fauna movement on the surface.
Are your scanners working yet?
She asked. Nothing yet. But I believe as soon as we... Static. Evie jerked her head up. She hadn't realized she'd been looking at her boots as she spoke.
Box? Come in.
Out of the corner of her eye, Cas and the others began to check their systems.
What happened? I'm not sure yet. Checking, Uma replied. We've lost all contact. Where were they when they went out of range? Over the third largest continent, near the planet's equator, right on course, River replied.
Evie could feel the panic rising in her throat, but she couldn't allow that to happen. She needed to remain cool in a crisis, and it took everything she had not to start screaming at the crew for answers.
Is there something that could be interfering with our systems, other than the planet's atmosphere?
Nothing that I see, Cas replied. Zal? I have nothing unusual, Captain. I can only assume whatever blocked our scanners is now blocking our communications with the shuttles.
What about visual communications? Can we still see them? She asked. I've lost them on visual, Uma replied. They slip below some cloud layers, and I can't see anything from the ship's cameras. We have to have something. They can't just have disappeared, Evie replied. I'm sorry, Captain, but we've lost them.
6. Check every system, Evie replied, stamping down the panic building at the back of her mind.
And prepare to send out visual probes. They should be able to pick up any debris on the surface.
She knew it was foolish, but by anticipating the worst-case scenario before it was confirmed, maybe she could insulate herself from it. I can confirm they didn't disintegrate in the atmosphere, Zal said. We would be seeing residual radiation and debris at even the upper layers of the atmosphere, and I'm detecting neither.
But the scanners aren't working. All we have are the visual cameras, Wolf replied. You ever seen things break apart in the atmosphere? It doesn't always leave traces. Sometimes the pieces are so small, it takes weeks of searching on the surface for even one clue.
Evie tried not to think about the details. Not only would it mean the loss of Laura, but also 40 of her crew, including Bax and Raffenkel. And it would be that many more people lost on her watch, which was unacceptable. She didn't care if she had to get in her own shuttle and go after them. She wasn't going to allow that to become her reality, no matter what it took. She clenched her fists until her fingernails dug into her palms.
Someone give me an update. Visual probes are ready to launch, Uma replied. Send them out. The first one on the same trajectory, and another 200 meters above it. Monitor what happens to the first probe. Aye, Uma replied.
Cas motioned her to the side. She didn't want to unplug from the activity in case they found something important, but she did so anyway, following him to the back wall where no one could hear them. What are we going to do if we can't contact them? We can't stay on the ship much longer. They couldn't very well follow Wave 1 if they didn't know what happened to them. But they couldn't stay put and die of asphyxiation and heat deprivation. They needed a lifeboat, and the planet was their only option.
I don't think we'll have much choice,
she replied. He sighed and pulled his head back, like something was bothering him.
What is it?
Nothing, he replied, which was obviously a lie. I guess I'm just worried about Box. She wanted to press him on it. After everything they'd been through, she hoped she could trust him not to lie anymore. But she couldn't force him to tell her what was wrong. She had to trust he'd make the right decision eventually.
Captain,
Uma called.
The probes are in position.
Evie left Cas by the wall and resumed her place in engineering.
Status. Probe 1 is headed along the same heading, descending at 12 degrees declination. Probe 2 is monitoring,
Uma said, bringing up the visual feed from Probe 2 as it tracked Probe 1 disappearing into the same cloud formation. She stared at the monitor until her console beeped at her.
Damn! It's lost the transmission.
Evie's composure was balancing on a knife's edge between hope and despair, unable to decide where to fall. She had to maintain her visage for both her own sanity as well as the crew's.
Captain, it seems no matter what we do, we're not going to find out what is beyond that barrier unless we go there ourselves, Tyler said.
Evie pulled her long ponytail over her shoulder.
I refuse to accept that. What about the landing site? Can the probe pick up anything from there?
No, Captain. But the landing site is no longer within visual. This atmospheric disturbance has blocked us from seeing anything in the surrounding area. It's like trying to see through a fog, Saul replied. Evie shook her head.
Consul? Any theories?
Zenfor hadn't even looked up when the shuttles disappeared. Instead, she'd hunched over her terminal, working on who knew what. Evie wasn't even sure if she had been listening.
Nothing concrete,
Zenfor replied, removing any doubt from Evie's mind.
Without further evidence, I'm not in a position to give an opinion.
True to form. Cas only shrugged, as if to say, we're out of options. She wasn't willing to leave her crew to their fate. Just because they couldn't contact them and they couldn't see them didn't mean they were dead. But the only way to make sure was to take the rest of the shuttles down behind them. Maybe once they got through the stratosphere, they would regain communications, at least within the planet's atmosphere. Though she wasn't quite sure how they were supposed to communicate with Tempest if they couldn't penetrate the planet's atmosphere. There was only one other course of action.
Load the second wave of shuttles, she said. We're going in after them. With any luck, they've already landed and are waiting for us. But we can't stay up here theorizing about it for another 5 days. Sester and Zenfor need the air we're about to leave behind, so we need to proceed with a plan. If anyone else has a better suggestion, I'm listening.
It took all her willpower to keep her thrumming heart from bursting through her ribs. She wasn't ready to face the possibility of what might have happened, and she was willing to stake her life on it if that's what it meant.
You can't be serious, Wolf replied. What if something in the atmosphere tore those ships to pieces? We can't go in there not knowing what we're facing. That's exactly what we're going to do, Evie replied. Sometimes you don't get to see the rules before you start playing. You have to just jump in and go with what you have.
You're talking about faith, Saul replied. She nodded.
I guess I am.
She turned her attention back on Wolf. A few days prior, the engineer had shaved off her pink mohawk, as she couldn't keep it the way she wanted it with their supplies so low.
If I can't do it right, I don't want to do it,
she told Evie when she asked. Looking at her now, Evie detected a confidence within her she wasn't sure she'd have if she'd been forced to shave her own head. It was in the way she held herself, like nothing fazed her.
You'll be in command of Wave 3, she said.
Wolf looked surprised at the announcement.
You want me in charge? She asked. You can coordinate with the remaining maintenance teams until it is time to leave. You've got plenty of experience, and I know you'll do what is right for the good of the ship. Cas and I will be busy establishing our temporary colony on the surface. as it's going to take both of us to coordinate all that needs to be done. Can I count on you?"
Wolf straightened her back, as if coming to attention.
"Yes, ma'am. Of course. It's just, I didn't expect you to choose me." "You're a qualified officer," Evie replied, "and I know you'll do a good job. As for everyone else, I want you to begin evacuation procedures. Wave 2 will be leaving in 1 hour."
There was a scuttle of activity. They hadn't finished loading all the shuttles yet, and most of the crew that was due to go down with 2 probably wasn't ready. But Evie'd had enough waiting around. Barring some kind of miracle, they were out of options, so they might as well get on with it. And if Wave 1 ran into trouble on their way down, she wanted to know about it as soon as possible. She turned to Cas to ask him if he had anything to add, only to find he was no longer at his post. She didn't see him anywhere else in engineering either. At some point he'd slipped out, and she hadn't even noticed. Cas trudged down the corridor, doing his best to keep his emotions off his face as he passed members of the crew. A general alert announcement blared all over the ship, informing everyone the timetable for Wave 2 had been moved up, and for everyone to be in their designated areas within the hour. Normally, he would have headed straight for Bay 1 and continued the process of loading all the equipment and supplies on the second set of shuttles. But all the fight had gone out of him, and he hadn't wanted anyone to see. He dared not consider the possibility Wave 1 was lost. He knew he would lose himself somewhere in the recesses of his mind and would never resurface. Because not only would it mean the loss of his oldest and best friend, but with so many of the crew lost, the ship wouldn't be able to function. Dragon-class ships required an absolute minimum of 90 to operate within regulations, and with a third of the crew on the first wave of shuttles, that already put them below the primary requirements to operate the ship safely. Which meant, even if Sester and Zenfor managed to get everything fixed, they were still dead in the water. There seemed to be no end to their string of bad luck, and Cas wasn't sure how much more he could take. Dealing with the Sargans daily had been a dream compared to this. He nodded at a group of crewmen trotting down the hallway beside him, packs on their backs and equipment in their hands, as they headed toward the bays. They returned the gesture, with even a few of them addressing him by Commander or Sir, neither of which he'd become accustomed to. Maybe Raffenkel was right. What was he doing here? Playing a part on some grand theater? The thought almost made him laugh out loud. After all, he'd always wanted to be an actor, and now he'd finally landed the role of a lifetime, lieutenant commander of a starship on which he had no business. No, he couldn't afford to think like that again. He was dropping into the dark places of his mind faster than he'd anticipated. His feet moved faster. There was relief from all this, and he was determined to get it. If he could just block all of it out, he could function well enough to get through the next few days, weeks, or whatever it took. Look at you, headed back to the well. Just can't help yourself. Cas shook the thoughts away and almost turned around, despite himself. But the voice wasn't wrong, and he wasn't as strong as he thought he was. It always came back to the same thing in the end. It always came back down to quenching the thirst. 7. Zenfor stood from her terminal, having finished all the calculations necessary to begin shutdown procedures on the ship. For the first time since she'd come aboard Tempest, she could describe herself as excited. Not ecstatic or elated, but perhaps anticipating with a small amount of glee. All the life forms on the ship were evacuating, leaving only her and Sester with some sweet silence for once. Being on this ship was like being within the middle of a currant's nest. Always a constant buzzing. Sometimes all the activity faded into the background and became noise, and other times it grated on her nerves, causing her to lose her temper at times when it wasn't necessary. But 4 weeks of nothing but silence, or very close to it, was cause for elation, if only a small amount.
"I would dare to say you're in a good mood."
Sester's thoughts flowed into her mind like a stream through a riverbed. It had been jarring the first time, but she found she'd become more accustomed to it, and even missed it when he didn't speak to her.
I look forward to some time alone. We are always alone, or we can be when we travel to the mine place. Yes, but it isn't the same.
Sester's ability to bring them both into a shared state of consciousness was nothing short of remarkable. But at the same time, it had its limits. They could spend only a few minutes within, and hours could pass in the real world, which she didn't care for. She'd always been cognizant of time, aware of its constant presence, and in the mind place, time seemed to lose meaning. While there, all of her senses were activated and working, but a part of her that knew it wasn't as real as the world she occupied the rest of the time. It was like a dream in many ways, real as it could be while they were there. But afterward, she was left with a sense of longing and loss for something she couldn't quite grasp. Her only solution seemed to be to either stay in the mind place forever or never return. Regardless, she didn't like either option.
I understand your concerns, and I apologize if it isn't the experience you want it to be. That isn't what I think. Perhaps I am too greedy. Perhaps I want too much.
There was the feeling of joy and laughter which rippled through her, though it hadn't come from her.
That's what the humans say.
Senfor suppressed a retort, because he wasn't sure if she should take it as an insult or a compliment. Not to mention, she had other matters to attend to.
Leave me be. I must work. We will speak later. I anticipate it with glee.
She shook her head. Finding a kindred spirit on a coalition starship had been the last thing on her mind when she boarded. But here he was, and for the first time in her life she felt as if she could be honest with someone without needing to filter her words through a sill sieve. And she knew he felt the same way. It was as if this was what she had been destined to do, despite the fact she didn't believe in such foolish notions.
Consul? What are you doing?
Senfor turned to see the captain standing before her, her hands on her hips, as if she were interrogating one of her junior officers.
I have begun the shutdown procedures for non-essential areas of the ship,
Senfor replied. It was the first in a long series of steps she devised to begin the repair work to the ship. They had to limit the power drain, and there was no reason not to start while the second wave of ships was still preparing to leave. It wasn't as if anyone would run out of life support before they boarded the shuttles.
I didn't give that order yet,
Diazol replied.
Given the severity of the situation, I thought taking immediate action would be prudent. It shouldn't impact the evacuation procedures.
She was surprised the captain was questioning her on this. These procedures were all Senfor had been working on for the past 2 days. Shutting down a Dragon-class ship wasn't like flipping a switch or turning a dial. There were a complex set of steps needed to make sure not only the computer cores were protected, but also the ignition systems and power transfer conduits weren't damaged. The ship wasn't designed to be shut down. It was supposed to operate continuously, and even though it was antiquated by Senfor standards, that didn't mean she wouldn't follow the proper procedure to ensure they could start everything back up again.
I want to make something clear. You do not have full autonomy here. While Cas and I are gone, you are working under the supervision of Commander Sester. And while I don't care about your personal life, I do expect you to follow the chain of command while you are on this ship, whether I'm here or not.
Senfor rose up to her full height, almost a full meter taller than Diazol.
Captain, nothing has changed. I am still a Sill on a coalition vessel, and I am still committed to working with you. If this ship cannot return me to Sill space, then I will be stranded out here forever. Do not think anything I do is not in the best interest of you and your crew, because our interests are aligned. But if you wish to continue to question my loyalty, then continue and find out how far my patience goes.
Diazol didn't flinch. Senfor found additional respect for the woman, despite the fact she was challenging her. Humans typically cowered in her presence, and even Cas was careful to maintain some composure when he was around her, never challenging her outright. Then again, he had felt the power of her fists on more than one occasion. Perhaps if Captain Diazol felt Zenfor's fury, she might not be so courageous. Though she suspected that might not be true. Diazol would take the beating and return for more, just to spite Zenfor. She smiled. Were Diazol a Sill instead of human, Zenfor would have considered her for top position on her own crew.
I am not questioning your loyalty, but I expect my orders to be followed. Is that understood?
Her face was like that of a statue, unwavering. What could drive her so deeply? Zenfor felt as if there were more to this woman than just an iron resolve. She'd seen glimpses of it before, and it was only becoming more evident. She would need to investigate further.
I understand, Captain, she finally replied. Do you wish for me to disengage the shutdown procedures? No, but notify me before taking any further action. We don't know what we're running into down there, and we might need Tempest to help us out. She can't do that if she's completely powerless. Do you expect Wave 2 to fare better than its predecessor? Zenfor asked, probing.
She'd seen something of the captain, and she wanted to see how far it would go. If Zenfor was right, she wouldn't break. A small flash of something crossed the captain's face. But it was either too fast or too human for Zenfor to decipher what it was. Not fear, but something else.
I don't know. But one way or another we'll find out. I am trusting you up here with my ship. Don't let me down. I don't go back on my promises, she replied.
Diazol held her gaze for a moment longer before heading off in the opposite direction.
You shouldn't goad the captain. She's under enough pressure as it is. I know, but that's precisely why I must. Tell me you don't suspect there was something about her which does not make sense. These visions she's had, and her ability to navigate us through the maze at Omicron Terminus.
She hadn't spent an abundant amount of time with the captain, but it wasn't hard to tell there was something foreign about her, and she wasn't even sure if the captain recognized it.
Will you tell me about your experiences together? I'm sorry, Sester said, but those are for her to divulge, not me. I understand, though I wish I understood better.
It would have to wait until the captain and the rest of the crew returned from the surface, if they returned. While Zenfor didn't necessarily believe the first wave of shuttles had broken up in the atmosphere or been destroyed, there was always a chance. And there was a chance she and Sester would be the only beings left on the ship. It was possible all 3 waves could leave and never return. Then it would just be the 2 of them for the rest of their natural lives. Would that be so bad?
I think you might find it lonely after a while. I can only provide so much. I'm not so sure about that,
Zenfor whispered, watching the rest of the engineering crew file out of the room. 8. Before Cas stood the answer to all his problems. It was a siren's song, pulling and dragging him ever closer. Damn the consequences, and damn what anyone else thought. He was tired of living for someone else's expectations. It was his life, and he could do as he pleased. So why was part of him so hesitant to step forward? The lounge had been sealed off ever since the initial attack back at Omicron Terminus, since it was considered a non-essential luxury, and maintaining the socializing and drinking establishment on the ship wasn't a high priority. Most of the furniture had been tossed around, and many of the bottles were smashed, their scents permeating the air as Cas stepped through the doors. He'd only been in here once since the attack, when he tried to lure Diamant into revealing his true intentions. And to some degree it had worked, but it hadn't prevented the man from taking over the ship. The day Evie had named him as first officer, he'd sworn off drinking until he was a full civilian again. Not just because it would affect his performance, but because he had felt different. He had something of a purpose again, and with all the repairs and minor emergencies all over the ship, it had kept him busy. He'd never had to face the real test, the one where he would find himself without his hours in the day filled. the one where he didn't have an excuse not to come down here every evening. But now everything had changed. With the potential loss of Wave 1, and the rest of them flying into the same danger without knowing what was ahead of them, Cas figured now was as good a time as any to start back up again. It always came back to excuses. He could always find an excuse to celebrate, and this was no different. He pushed errant chairs aside as he made his way through the room to the bar on the far side. Many of the bottles had spilled or broken, but a few remained intact and still on the shelves, those with magnetic locks or other safeguards in place. Cas couldn't even read half the labels, as they were often in a native planet's tongue. But did it really matter? As long as it was amber and alcoholic, did he really care? He pulled a delicious-looking bottle, its contents the color of honey, off the middle shelf. The label looked as if it was written in Hosmas Riza, the letters and shapes all flowy with accented ends. He wasn't much of a paleographer, but he was reasonably sure the bottle was at least a couple 100 years old, based on the script. And it hadn't even been opened. He tore the paper and pulled the artificial cork away, allowing the liquid inside to breathe for the first time in centuries. 600 bottles in here, and you choose the rarest one, a gruff voice said from the doors of the lounge. Cas glanced up to see the silhouette of a broad-shouldered man, a slight reflection coming off his bald head, though the rest of him was in shadow. Marshall? Aren't you supposed to be in the evacuation area? Cas asked, setting the bottle down. I'm sure no one's noticed. Marshall stepped into the light. He had a light gray beard which matched his eyes perfectly, though he didn't look old in the traditional sense. If Cas had to guess, he'd say Marshall was probably in his 50s, though his build suggested someone who could still be in their 30s, especially his arms, which seemed to strain the fabric holding them in. They were probably the reason he was such an intimidating bartender. He and Cas hadn't had much interaction, other than Marshall cutting him off more than once. Marshall walked around the bar, staring at Cas like a predator as he watches his next meal. Do you have any idea how hard that stuff is to find? He didn't. He hadn't even been sure what it was. But if it was to be his last drink, he'd made a fitting choice. Cas shrugged. It smells good. I'm tired of finding you in my bar. Cas glanced at the bottle and sat on one of the stools. I don't blame you. I'm tired of being here. What the hell are you doing? Get off that stool. This isn't a therapy session. You can either leave here of your own free will, or I can toss you out. It's your choice. Cas tried to keep the amusement from his face. You know you're a civilian, right? This is a military ship. You don't have... This is a civilian business leased to the military with a contract, and I can remove anyone I feel fit. I'm not like those robot bartenders that will just stop serving you. I'll make sure you're out. How did you even know I was in here? Cas asked, keeping his seat on the stool and hand on the bottle. Marshall held up his hand. Underneath the skin, his comm blinked with a muted red. Installed a monitor after I found out someone was in here before without permission. Don't suppose you know who that was? He worked his large jaw underneath the beard, as if he were chewing on metal. It was for an operation. I was gathering intelligence from a hostile alien, Cas replied. Uh-huh. And you decided to break in today for what? The good old days? He spread his hands out on the bar, leaning forward just enough to make himself more intimidating. Just a last hurrah, Cas replied, before heading off for my destiny. You think the ships were destroyed in the atmosphere. Marshall shook his head. I can assure you they weren't. Cas frowned. How would a civilian know what happened to those ships? Call it intuition. Your friend is fine. They're all fine. Now either drink that or leave my bar so I can close it up before leaving it for 4 weeks. At least I know the Sill and the Claxion won't be coming in here. Cas sighed, standing. Maybe he didn't want the drink after all. He pushed the bottle back across the bar to Marshall. I wish I had your confidence. Thanks for whatever. He made it halfway to the door before the man behind the bar called out to him. Wait. Cas turned. I'm not supposed to be doing this, but if you had more of a hurt puppy look, I'd have to house train you. Marshall came out from behind the bar. You've lost a lot of people, and you've had to deal with near insurmountable odds. And yet, you're still here. So, what's the problem? Cas wasn't about to unload all his problems on someone he didn't know. He'd just come in here for a drink, and Marshall had ended up reminding him why he'd stopped. So, as far as Cas was concerned, he was done. It's nothing. I'm fine. I'd believe that lie if I hadn't seen the exact same look on your face every time you came in here to get smashed. The first 50 times I took you for just another drunk, numbing the pain of his life away because he had nothing better to do with his time. But it turns out you're a little more complicated than that. Isn't that right? Cas took a step toward the door. I'm not in the mood to talk about it. Isn't that what bartenders are for? To give advice? And you've been moping around here so often, you're finally going to get some. Didn't you just say this wasn't a therapy session? Cas stopped in his place as Marshall continued. It's not. It's a life lesson. Let me tell you something about loss. Loss will fuck you up in ways you never imagined. It will split you right down the middle into two people. One who continues to live a life on the outside, acting as if everything is fine and going about their business, and the other who lives inside now, wanting back what they can never have. And that inside person will tear the outside person apart if they can. Because if they're miserable, then everyone deserves to be. Am I right? Cas turned to him, unsure what to say. He'd never heard anyone put it quite so bluntly. But he did feel as if there was another part of himself deep within that wanted nothing more than to writhe in pain. Pain that he had both caused and been caused. That inner person was toxic. Rabot. That's French, right? Marshall asked. Cas didn't know. He wasn't even sure what French was, much less what it had to do with his family name. All he knew was he was 16th or 17th generation. The line went so far back he didn't even bother to look or care. They had good food, is my point. Doesn't matter. But just like with food, if you have one spice that's too powerful, it can ruin the entire dish. If you continue to focus on that pain and that inside person, it will ruin the rest of you. You might not even realize it, but one day you'll wake up and find you become a bitter, lonely old person who is full of hate and regret. And that's what that inner person wants. It wants to ruin you because he feels ruined. And what I'm telling you is, don't give in to it. No matter how hopeless you feel, no matter how bad things get, don't you give in to that person. Because it is so much harder to come back out. That, he pointed to the bar where the open bottle still sat, that is like an undercurrent right to where you don't want to go. Cas stood back, defiant. His first instinct was to refute everything Marshall had said, to tell him he was off the mark, that Cas was perfectly fine, even though he knew he wasn't. Otherwise, why would he be here? A celebratory drink? Right. Not even Box would have believed that one. And how did Marshall know everyone on the shuttles was fine? Was he just talking out of his ass? Anyway, Marshall said, retreating into the space of the lounge, picking up chairs and overturned tables as he went. That's enough introspection. Like I said, I'm not supposed to do that. But both you and the captain are in fragile states. What are you, some kind of telepath? Cas asked. He laughed. Just a man who can read people. Nothing more, nothing less. He picked up another chair, pushing it under one of the tables. Until this moment, Cas hadn't paid much attention to Marshall, other than being annoyed when he called Box or Evie into the bar to come fetch him. He wasn't even sure what planet or colony he was from. As soon as Cas got some free time, he was going to do some research. There was something strange about this man, and he needed to find out what. He could be a security threat if they weren't careful. Wait, what was he thinking? This was the bartender, not some Sargant spy. Green never would have approved of him being on the ship if he hadn't already been thoroughly vetted. But something still nagged at the back of Cas's mind. The intership comm system activated. Wave 2 shuttles will be leaving in 20 minutes. All hands report to final launch stations. Maintenance crews 4 through 7, stand by. Looks like your ride is about to take off, Marshall said. Better get down there. And don't worry about getting to the surface. You'll be fine. Surely you're not staying on the ship, Cas said, feeling very exposed. Nope. I'll be right behind you. Just have to clean up a few more things in here first. Cas hesitated a moment, then turned to leave. Had that conversation actually happened? Had it even been a conversation? As he replayed the words, they felt more like a lecture than anything else. Was that what made a good bartender? Their ability to see through all the bullshit and get right to the heart of the issue? He supposed so. But then again, it felt like a lot more than that with Marshall. It was as if the man could see right into him, even the parts he tried to keep hidden from himself. It was a strange sensation. Oh, and Rabot? Marshall called as Cas reached the door. If you're feeling unsure, just stay close to those who know you best. You can't go wrong there. Cas only narrowed his eyes and left the man as he cleaned off the bar. He wasn't sure what to make of Marshall anymore. But it turned out not to matter, because the further he walked from the lounge, the more unlikely the conversation seemed, until he wasn't sure if he had imagined the whole thing or not. 9. Evie stepped onto the largest shuttle of Wave 2, making her way through the cargo area, which had been packed to the brim with supplies. They couldn't take everything on Tempest, but they could haul enough to take care of their basic needs for a few weeks. If they managed to land safely, she hoped to build a constant supply line between Tempest and the surface. But at the moment, the repairs to the Tempest weren't her biggest concern. She was anxious to get moving for reasons obvious to her and no one else. Lieutenant Rond and Ensign River sat at the helm and navigation stations respectively, having transferred over from their temporary positions in engineering. She couldn't help but be proud of them both. After the incident with Box, when they were attempting to infiltrate Syl space, she wasn't sure she could still trust Rond. But it turned out, without Lieutenant Page around, Isaac Rond was a model officer. But she also suspected it had something to do with Ensign River, as she'd seen them together off the bridge. The desire not to want to disappoint someone was a powerful one, perhaps more powerful than anything else. Evie tapped her comm.
Captain Jan? Are your pilots in position? Yes, ma'am. Blackfield, Coley, C, and I will all be escorting you down. We're coming into position now, awaiting the arrival of all the shuttles. Thank you, Captain. Stand by.
Evie cut the comm. She was thankful Raffinkel had gone down with Wave 1. While she was a fine pilot chief, her impulsiveness grated on Evie's nerves. Sometimes it was warranted, and others it was nothing but bravado. Captain Jan seemed much more reserved. She'd have to remember to thank Cas for recommending her. Behind her, Zal and Uma filtered into the shuttle's wide cockpit. It was bigger than most, as the shuttle itself was one of the largest on the ship and had places for at least 4 crew in the front section.
What's our status? Evie asked. Loading the last of the shuttles now. Just waiting on a few personnel, Uma replied. Status of Tempest?
Consul Zenfor is continuing to shut down primary systems, Zal replied. The ship should be on minimal power in a few hours. The maintenance crews are working in the affected sections according to her repair schedule.
And Wave 3?
Commander Wolf reports they will be ready to launch in 3 hours, assuming they don't run into any problems loading the last batch of shuttles. Evie nodded, even though his back was turned to her. She knew she should wait and head down with Wave 3 to make sure everything was buttoned up, but she'd already run 100 worst-case scenarios in her mind and was anxious to put them to rest. She didn't like not knowing what was going on, and the loss of contact with Wave 1 was having a hell of an impact on her anxiety. She couldn't help but wonder if she would be so worried if Laura had not been on those ships. She would still care about her crew, of course, but she might not be so gung-ho to get down to the surface. There was still the possibility the planet's atmosphere was impenetrable, and that they would die as they tried to enter, but she didn't think that was the case. Otherwise, why would she have had the vision of herself on the surface? They hadn't come all this way just to fall on their faces. Although, what if the vision had meant she was the only one who could reach the surface safely? That was something she hadn't considered until now, and a fresh wave of anxiety coursed through her.
That's it, Captain. All the other shuttles report ready. All crew and supplies are on board, Uma reported.
Evie glanced around. A few more of the crew milled around in the section behind the shuttles, but she didn't see Cas anywhere. Had he boarded another shuttle?
Where's our first officer? She asked.
Checking, Saul replied. I'm here, Cas said, pushing through the back compartment and entering the cockpit. Sorry, I got sidetracked.
Everything okay?
Evie asked. He regarded her. Is it ever? Let's just get this over with. She couldn't agree more. Cas was probably as worried about Box as she was about Laura.
You heard the man. Clear the moorings and initiate launch procedures, Evie ordered.
Aye, Ron replied, while River plotted their course. Cas tapped the comm at the back of his hand. Consul, take care of her for us.
You don't have to worry, Zenfor replied. Everything will be better than you left it when you return.
Cas cut the comm. Evie glanced at Uma, but she still had her back to them. She couldn't help but think her tactical officer might be right, that leaving the ship in the hands of a Sill might not be the best idea. But they couldn't leave Sester alone, and Zenfor had done more than enough to prove herself trustworthy. Things might have gotten off to a rocky start, but she'd saved the ship more than once. It wasn't as if she was going to convince Sester they should run off together, although the thought did bring a smile to her face. What? Cas asked, eyeing her.
Nothing. Just thinking about how life is funny sometimes, she replied.
Evie rolled her shoulders and stretched her neck until it cracked, gathering up her resolve. The length of the blade strapped to her back reminded her to keep her posture straight. She wished they had installed more chairs in here, but it would have to do. Assuming everything went to plan, they should be on the planet's surface in less than 10 minutes. Ahead of them, the length of the bay stretched out, then rushed forward as Ron piloted them out into open space, where the 4 space wings sat, suspended on invisible threads in the darkness. The emerald planet below shone as the system's star reflected off the surface, but the cloud cover was so dense Evie could only spot edges of some of the continents. Perhaps most brilliant, though, were the planet's rings tilted at their odd angle. She couldn't wait to see what they looked like from the surface. Shuttles have cleared the bay, Captain, Saul said.
Tempest, keep an eye on us. Hopefully this goes better than Wave 1, Evie said into her comm. We've got you on the scanners, Captain, Wolf replied. So far, everything is clear.
Evie peered around the edge of the shuttle window to look at Tempest. It was so small from out here, and so fragile. It was their only lifeline back home, and a lot of things had to go right for them to get there. And so far, luck hadn't been on their side. But this was where things changed.
Ensign, plot a course separate from that of Wave 1. If they did run into trouble, we don't want the same thing to happen to us.
She looked at Cas for approval, and he nodded.
Maybe if we take a different way down, it will help spread the risk. Aye, River replied.
This was the absolute worst way to do this, and she knew it, but they were out of time. If the ship had been in better working order, they could have taken more time to study the planet, figure out a way to break through the interference. But then again, if the ship was in better working order, they wouldn't need to head down in the first place. All shuttles are clear and in formation. The Space Wings have taken positions around us, Ron said.
Ensign? Evie asked. Course plotted and ready when you are, Captain.
Evie tapped her comm.
Wave 2? This is the captain. We're heading in. Stay in formation. Anything unexpected happens, improvise.
The comm grid received confirmations from everyone.
Okay, let's do it.
The formation banked to the right, and the planet took up more of the view screen until it was all they could see. Differing shades of verdant green in the atmosphere and what little could be seen below it canvassed their view. Evie could only hope her intuition was right, and this wasn't a mistake. But if this was going to be the last thing she ever did, she was satisfied she'd done everything she could for her crew and her people.
Captain, there seems to be a disturbance gathering in the vicinity where we're planning to enter the atmosphere, Uma said.
Is it the same phenomena we saw with Wave 1? Cas asked.
Yes, sir, Zal replied. It matches. Electromagnetic interference is preventing me from seeing past the storm.
Trial by fire, huh? Cas whispered to Evie.
Not my first choice.
Once was an anomaly, twice a coincidence. Or was it? The presence of these storms at the exact spot they planned to enter the atmosphere must mean there was some intelligence behind them. Either that, or they were a natural reaction to anything approaching the planet, like an immune system. Neither made Evie feel any better. What if the planet was somehow protecting itself?
Steady, helm. Take us in easy. We don't need to punch our way through.
Yes, ma'am, Rod replied. Evie glanced at Cas again. His face was glued to the planet growing in the viewer before them. Even though they were entering at a soft angle, it looked much harsher, as if they were coming straight down like a meteor. Through the clouds, Evie caught flashes of light, turning the green of the clouds to a deep teal and back again. We might want to hold on to something, Cas said. She agreed, stepping over to the nearest station. She tapped her comm again.
All hands of Wave 2, brace.
Evie spread her feet, wedging herself between one side of the wall and the console as she bore down, waiting for the inevitable. When it struck, she thought they'd experienced a hull breach. The jolt was so violent she lost her grip on the console and would have gone flying had she not wedged her body between them. People who hadn't secured themselves in time flailed in the back compartments. Grunts and cries of pain filled the air. The bridge crew managed to stay in their seats, if only for their seat harnesses, and despite the turbulence which wasn't letting up, continued to push the ships forward.
I've got alerts coming in from all ships,
Uma yelled over the din. It had become increasingly loud in the cockpit, and based on the wind, lightning, and now hail which was pounding on the outside of the shuttle, Evie wasn't surprised.
They are all fighting to maintain control. Have we lost anyone?
Evie yelled.
Not yet. We're all still there,
Uma replied. I'm picking up similar readings from what Wave 1 experienced, Zal said, and I can no longer raise Tempest. We've temporarily lost contact. I don't think it's that temporary, Cas said. Evie had the same thought. This was the final test. If they broke up in the atmosphere, Tempest would have no way to know not to send Wave 3. The planet was devouring them one by one.
Zal, can you rig a probe to launch in the event the shuttle is destroyed? One that can get back out of the atmosphere?
The shuttle lurched, and everyone jerked to the side. Evie held on for dear life. I'm sorry, Captain, but I'm not sure any of our probes could take this much punishment.
Do it anyway, she ordered.
Yes, ma'am. The ship continued to shudder, and Evie closed her eyes for a moment, hoping it would pass soon. She couldn't stand the thought of being sucked out into the atmosphere and falling the rest of the way down. It was a terrible feeling. I think it's clearing, Rond yelled. Evie's eyes snapped open, and she glanced up, realizing he was right. The clouds weren't as dense, and the hail had turned to rain. Whether it was rain made of water vapor or carbon dioxide, she didn't know, but rain was better than hail, no matter what. As they continued down, the turbulence in the shuttle lessened to the point where she could dislodge herself from behind the console. The clouds grew lighter, and the rain became a patter instead of an onslaught.
"We're breaking through,"
Rivers said. She was right. The outlines of land masses appeared below them, whole stretches of surface, only a few kilometers down. The atmosphere hadn't been as thick as it had looked, and as the clouds cleared, a lush jungle spread out before them. In the distance, the planet's ocean, also tinted a shade of green, stretched out before them. But now that they were inside the atmosphere, everything had much more color to it. For the first time, she felt hopeful.
"We're almost clear, Captain. A few more minutes,"
Ron said.
"Any sign of Wave 1?
She asked. "Nothing on our scanners," Saul said, "but I am picking up something in the distance, about 30 kilometers due west. It's a reflective tower of some kind, but the metals register as galvanium and cyclax."
"That has to be them,"
Evie said. "As soon as we get closer, I'll—" He was interrupted by all the stations on the shuttle going dark at once. And before Evie realized what had happened, the ship was in a free fall.